Thank you all for being here at the Pennsylvania Literary Festival today. And kind of a little change in our program, we've brought up George von Banko, legendary sports broadcaster and expert on sports both locally and throughout our region. George has written 3 books. The first 2, Memory Lane and Memory Lane Volume 2, are a collection of columns that George has written for local newspapers, and they appear weekly in the Uniontown Herald Standard, the Memory Lane columns. Sports Talk is based on George's interviews from his broadcasting career, and as George can tell you, he's worked with some of the greats from Myron Cope to Stan Savran, and George himself is one of the greats. So, George, can you tell us a little bit, for folks that are visiting the area, and maybe even some locals, they might not realize just what a hotbed Fayette County has been for athletes that have gone on to play collegiate athletics and semi-pro and professional. Can you give us a little overview of that?
Well, Fayette County sports history is very rich. In fact, it led to me forming the Fayette County Sports Hall of Fame with Jess Hudson about 6 years ago, and that event, which comes up in June, has been a huge success, and our sports history stacks up with anybody when you look at the athletes that came out of this area. The question I get asked a lot about Memory Lane is, are you running out of people to write about? And the answer is no, because every time I research one person, I come up with 3 other people to write about. Memory Lane actually came about because I had a bit of bad luck and lost the job doing Duquesne University basketball back in 2010. And my father was still alive at the time, and he said, George, people have been bugging you to do a compilation of your columns in book form. Now you don't have any excuse that you don't have time. So I did the first book, Memory Lane, and actually the oldest living Heisman Trophy winner, Johnny Lujack, from Connellsville, Pennsylvania, wrote the foreword for this book. And it is just chock full of some great athletes from our area, folks like Charlie Hyatt. People may not know about Charlie Hyatt. He was the only 3-time basketball All-American in the history of University of Pittsburgh basketball. He played back in the 20s. Will Robinson, the great Laurel Highlands All-American. Coach Abe Everhart is in here. Bill Power. Vivian Stringer, the coach at Rutgers, the great basketball coach. She's from Edenborn, Pennsylvania, German Township. So this book came out, and a little bittersweet note with this book. My dad was on his deathbed when the book was released, and I gave him the first copy, and he was so pleased. And the next day I came to the hospital to visit him, and I'm walking past the nurse's station, and one of the nurses says to me, Mr. Von Banko, you owe me a book. And I looked at her and I said, what do you mean? And she says, I just gave $15 to your dad. Dad was selling books to the nurses 3 days before he died. What a great story.
One of your biggest fans then.
Yeah, he was one of my biggest fans. And then Memory Lane Volume 2 came out, more compilations of the Memory Lane column, and Bobby Locke from Redstone, who pitched for the Cleveland Indians and 4 other major league teams in here. Stu Lance, the great Uniontown player. Don Krofcheck, who played in the pros. It's just full of more great athletes from our area. And both these books are really doing well. And then Dad passed away in 2011. And I had been a pack rat going back to my days when I was on WTAE. It used to be Myron Cope, Stan Savran, and me at night on WTAE. And I had saved all of the interviews, but we had moved a couple of times, and I thought that they had got lost during the moves. Dad passes away, and I'm going through a closet at the house, and God bless him, there was a box in the back of the closet that had 250 interviews in it from my talk show days. Some of them so old that they were on reel to reel. And that was the genesis of Sports Talk. That is based on some of my favorite interviews that I was able to salvage from those tapes from my talk show career. This book is actually selling nationally because of the people that are in it. The baseball section, Chipper Jones, Harvey Haddix on the 30th anniversary of his 12 perfect innings in Milwaukee. The former Pirate general manager Joel Brown just before he passed away. Billy Williams and Ron Santo, the great Cubs stars. Basketball, Rod Hundley, Jerry West, Al McGuire, Bobby Knight. a great broadcasting section. Don Dunphy, the great boxing announcer. Dick Enberg, the voice on NBC for many years. Ray Scott from Connellsville, Pennsylvania, the former voice of the Green Bay Packers. Football people like Ernie Ladd, Charlie Johnson, John Brody, Hank Stram, the great coach of the Chiefs, Terry Bradshaw, and in hockey, Mario Lemieux, Bobby Orr, Brad Park, and Brian Trottier. So this book is just loaded with some great interviews, and some very interesting things came to light in this book. For instance, Harvey Haddix, when I interviewed him, that interview took place May 25th in 1989. His 12 perfect innings were on May 26th of 1959. So it was the 30th anniversary of his 12 perfect innings. And it was the first time in an interview that he had ever revealed that Bob Buell, who was pitching for the Braves back in 1959, told him at an old-timers game that the Braves were actually stealing signs that night. Buell was sitting in the bullpen with a catcher, and they had binoculars, and they were stealing the Pirates' signs, and Buell would put a coat over his shoulder if it was going to be a fastball, and take the coat off his shoulder if it was going to be a breaking pitch, which makes his feat even more remarkable if you think about it. They knew what was coming, and they still couldn't hit him for 12 innings.
Now, we're surrounded by writers here, George, and you're a great writer and journalist, and it doesn't, from the list of people that that you've read to me and shared with me, there's not many people that say no to an interview with George von Banko, and they tell you some great stories. What's your technique in getting these athletes to open up to you, and maybe what have you learned from some of the folks that you've worked with, like Myron Cope and Stan Savard?
Well, Myron always said that there's a right way and a wrong way to go about going after a story, and unfortunately, that's sort of lost in today's sports journalism, particularly on radio. It's more shock jock sensationalism, throw it up against the wall and see if it sticks without getting the basic facts. Myron was all about the facts. You got to have the facts, you got to know what you're talking about, and you got to be able to, tell the story. If it doesn't have legs to stand up, then it's not a story. And that was his big thing. And, Myron was a great writer in his own right. I remember he used to write for Sports Illustrated and did several books. Stan was sort of the same way. When I was on radio following them, they were such strong personalities that I felt that I had to have my own niche, which was hard to form following those two guys. My show was more guest-driven. Not that they didn't have guests, but I had guests every night. And I developed a great guest list for the contacts I made over the years. And Stan, to this day, always says I had the best guest list in the city of Pittsburgh. I mean, you could tune in one night and you'd hear Billy Packer or Don Dunphy or Bob Knight or Al McGuire and people like that. And as far as talking to them is just a conversational format, I always had the approach, it's just like I'm sitting down at a local pub and I'm talking sports with somebody. And that was the way I was with the callers, too. That's the secret to it. After a while, you make them feel at ease, and if they're at ease, they'll tell you things that they might not tell other people.
Now, you mentioned talking to Lemieux, and so you've been around the Pittsburgh sports scene for forever. What have you observed in watching him evolve from a player to now an owner and helping to keep the Penguins here in Pittsburgh?
Well, when I first met Lemieux, his English was so-so. It got better over the years. And actually, the metamorphosis of when he was a young player to the polished professional he became a very, very good interview. And now you figured that the language barrier when he first came in, he had to battle that, but he got very good at it. It's unfortunate now that as owner of the Penguins, he really does not do very many interviews. And it's a shame because he became a very, very good interview when you got him to open up, but he's sort of in the background. But, talk about giving back to your community. That team was headed out of town. He got Consol Energy built. He kept the Penguins here. He saved the franchise.
Right. Yeah. Now, George, you have a radio show, and can you give folks a little preview of, like, maybe I had a show yesterday. What's a typical George von Banko radio show like on WMBS? Who are some of the folks that you talk to?
Well, unfortunately, in talk radio today, an open line segment has become something dirty in talk radio. They don't like to do open line segments. I always start every show with an open line segment where you can talk about anything you want to talk about in the world of sports. And I tell some of my colleagues that the reason you guys don't like to do open line shows is your background is not deep enough to be able to do an open line segment when you don't know what they're going to throw at you. You have to be pigeonholed into a specific subject area. I do an open line segment. We usually have several taped interviews throughout the show. Yesterday it was Pirate shortstop Jordy Mercer, Lance Moore, the new wide receiver for the Steelers that they signed from New Orleans, Stephon Tuitt, the second-round pick for the Steelers, and then I did a live segment with Jim Wexell, Steelers beat writer for Steel City Sports Insiders.com, and we talked about the Steeler draft and the OTAs that are going on right now, looking ahead to training camp in July.
So if folks want to tune in, can you give the time and of your show?
I'm on from 10:15 to 12 noon every Saturday on 590 WMBS.
That's great. So if you've been missing George's columns or radio shows and you need to do
let's tell
some...
them when the column is due, every Monday in the Uniontown Herald Standard.
Right?
Yes, yeah.
So if you've been missing the columns or radio shows, you can catch up through these Memory Lane books, volumes 1 and 2, as well as Sports Talk, which chronicles George's years in radio broadcasting.
And I told you yesterday when I showed this to you, there's a picture of a young George Von Banko in the old WTA studios, as Stan used to say, back in the golden age of Pittsburgh talk radio. That's the old WTA mic flag right there. And also on the back cover, I'm at a banquet with Myra Cope, Darrell Hess, and that's me at this banquet. So it's an interesting journey.
And when you read one of George's books, you'll feel like you know these athletes personally, because he gets to the heart and soul of who these athletes are as players and as people. At this time, we have a handheld mic in the audience. Chris has it there. Chris, if you had some questions, additional questions for George, or if our other folks had any questions about Pittsburgh athletics or our region sports.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay. I heard you talking about the Pens. They recently just got rid of their general manager and their coach, and I was wondering what...
Actually, they did not get rid of the coach,
Okay.
which was surprising.
Yeah. So what do you think the take is, and why they got rid of him, and how they're going to move forward from there?
Well, the reason the change was made was the playoff failures over the last 5 years. I mean, this was a team that supposedly was built to win the Stanley Cup, and they've had nothing but abject failure in the playoffs for the past 5 years, losing to lower-seeded teams. So I was a little surprised the way it came down. I thought for sure that Bausma would get the axe, because I think he's lost the locker room a little bit. And they fired Shiro, the general manager, and Bausma is still the coach, which is a little surprising, although Bob Grove, who is a marvelous source for anything Penguins, he's on the Penguins radio network and does their post-game show, told me something that actually I researched and I found he was right. Very rarely in the course of the history of the Penguins, when they've made changes like this, have they ever fired the coach and the general manager at the same time. They've never done it. Usually it was one and then the other, which is what happened now. They're going to leave the coaching decision to the new general manager, and I really can't see him keeping Bausma. I think it's just a formality when he's named. Do you want to keep this guy, or do you want to name your own guy? And I think they'll name a new coach. Who the general manager is going to be is really interesting. Lemieux said that it would be about a 2-week process. We just passed 2 weeks. And I've heard a lot of names, Marc Bergevin from Montreal, the guy down at Tampa Bay, a name that keeps popping up. And I agree with Rob Rossi from the Tribune Review that I think the Penguins are using him more as a sounding board for their search than actually a candidate, is Pierre Maguire, who's on the NBC telecast. I just can't see Maguire being the general manager. He doesn't have a great track record in scouting or in coaching. Plus, he's got a pretty good job already. We already saw that happen with Brisbane, the agent, Pat Brisson, the agent for Sidney Crosby and several other greats. He turned him down. He was not interested because he's got a great job. But so that's going to be interesting to see what direction they go in. And the new general manager, what a checklist he's got starting in July. they've got a lot of decisions about a lot of players to make.
Going back to the players, decisions they have to make, do you think they're going to end up keeping, who was it, Niskanen or Neal? I heard Neal might want to trade.
I think they would love to keep Matt Niskanen. Unfortunately, the rumor is that the Philadelphia Flyers are interested in his services, and the Penguins have salary cap issues, so they only have so much to spend, so it might be a problem if they jack the price up on him. James Neal, I think, will be traded. And I think they can get a good return on James Neal because he's got a favorable contract. Anybody else?
Well, thank you, George.
Well, we got another
we
question.
got another question.
Yeah.
With the popularity of the book Moneyball that was made into a movie, do you ever see Major League Baseball and the Players Association ever agreeing? Do you ever see a day when there will either be a basement, on spending or a salary cap?
No. I've said many times on my talk show that the Major League Baseball Players Association has been so successful in their battles with ownership, and ownership has shot themselves in the foot in these battles. But I mean, I liken ownership to the French Army. They've lost every war they've been in, and they've lost to the Major League Baseball. The Players Association will never agree to that. I've said on my show, we will have peace in the Middle East before there's ever a salary cap in baseball. So it's not going to happen. I think that does it.
Okay, thank you, George. Make sure you take a look at George's table and for the books Memory Lane, Volume 1 and 2, as well as Sports Talk, and listen in for George's radio show on WMBS, and look for the columns in the Uniontown Herald Standard. Thank you, George, and please stay tuned. We got an episode of Going Live coming up here at the Pennsylvania Literary Festival.